Today I propose to take you to a place with a dark presence, a looming presence, and a bleak beauty of a sort. Unforgettable. The soil is dark, and it's undoubtedly soaked in the blood of men. It's a place of heather, thistles, gorse, willow herb, foxgloves, pine, spruce, beech, alder and birch. That being the ancient botany of the Highlands of Scotland. All around is natural beauty, but it sits side by side with a terrible past. Some folk who visit feel the past, see the past, because it lingers in the air. Before we get to the episode, another haunting, can I say thanks to everyone who supports this channel by signing up to my patreon.com site. If you've done that, thanks a million. It's that support, that practical support, that keeps everything going. If you go to patreon.com and follow the instructions, you will find that for about the price of a cup of coffee every month, you get early access to all my content, and you get exclusive access to some content, including a question and answer session. It's all on my website. The details are everywhere, readily found. There's an address for it all down there somewhere. Okay, that's the advert over. Let's go to the place called Culloden. Listen to this. I quote, "In August 1748, before the town council of Aberdeen, 11 men and women swore to the truth of a vision which they said they had seen in a valley 5 miles to the west of the city. On the 5th of that month, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, they saw 3 globes of light in the sky above, which they first took to be weather galls, but which increased in brilliance until 12 men in clean and bright attire crossed the valley. Then were seen 2 armies. The first wore clothing of dark blue and displayed St. Andrew's cross on its ensigns. The other was uniformed in scarlet and was assembled beneath the Union flag. Twice the Red Army attacked the Blue, and twice it was beaten back. When it rallied and attacked for a third time, it was routed and scattered by the Scots army. Those who watched saw the smoke of the cannon, the glitter of steel, and the colours waving, but they heard no sound. When the Blue Army was triumphant, the vision passed." That's from John Preble's book called Culloden. This was testimony genuinely recorded in Aberdeen in 1748. And I draw your attention specifically to 3 globes, 3 lights, 3 circular lights in the sky, growing brighter. And then 12 tall men in clean and bright attire. Whatever that means. Given a lot of what's going on around us at the moment, or it's kind of fallen out of the news a little bit, but it sounds like UFOs to me, or UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena, as we're being schooled to describe such sights now. And what about the 12 tall men in garments that caught the attention of the witnesses? I don't know. Interdimensional beings, anyone? I'm also intrigued by the colours of the 2 armies, one red and one blue. I mean, obviously it brings to mind, the traditional colours of Scotland and England, if you like. But those colours, and the third those colours make together, which is purple, are recurrent in dreams and visions. Purple is a significant, meaningful colour. But to get to the specifics of today, so, what do we know so far? 2 years after the last pitched battle on British soil. A pitched battle, incidentally, technically is a battle where 2 forces arranged to meet. They set a date and a location, and they come together deliberately to settle a matter. That's a pitched battle. It doesn't happen organically or by accident. One group's bumping into the other. A pitched battle is prearranged. And so 2 years after the horror of Culloden, witnesses swore they saw the battle reenacted in a ghostly fashion in a glen by Aberdeen, a glen outside the city of Aberdeen. Culloden's a place, and it's a story that is sort of close to me for various reasons. I visited the battlefield for the first time with my dad, my dear departed dad. In November of this year, he'll have been dead for 5 years, but he took me to Culloden for the first time. There we visited one of the clan graves. There are boulders with clan names on them that are supposed to mark mass graves of the different clans of Highlanders that died on the day. I got a photograph taken by the Cameron grave marker because my mum was told by her dad when she was a little girl that he and she were descended from Cameron of Lochiel, also known as the Gentle Lochiel, who was the clan chief who was the first to have his men stand alongside Charles Edward Stuart, better known as Bonnie Prince Charlie, for his ill-fated attempt to reclaim the British throne on behalf of his father, who would have been James III and VIII. I've also worked there. I've done archaeological work there, I've done television work there, I've visited it on numerous occasions, and I definitely feel a sense of connection to it, even a sense of ownership to some extent, because if the family tradition is right, then family blood was spilt there. I would say more widely that the Highlands of Scotland are worn thin like old fabric. It's a tough place. Life was hard in the Highlands, but always, up until the modern era. It's a tough place to live. And that hardship, generation after generation, took a toll. And I think it helps to explain a lot of the traditions and the culture of the Highlands. A lot of things that were said, things that were remembered, things that were thought and believed. For example, in the Highlands, you find faith in the so-called second sight, or more properly, the two sights. It's a psychic ability, if you like, that some swear to. But the two sights is the ability to see, to perceive the here and now and the future, sort of side by side, the one curled inside the other. People with the two sights don't seem to have much control over it. The visions come when they come. People haven't really traditionally been able to do much about it. They just sometimes see the second sight. It can come in the day, it can come in the night, it can wake them. Any delving into esoteric thought invites a person to contemplate the potential that was understood by the ancestors and right up into the present day. If you speak with people paying attention to phenomena routinely dismissed by scientific types as paranormal, and let's be honest, most people are pretty sceptical about the so-called paranormal. But still today, if you speak to people who take all of that seriously and seek to investigate it with an open mind, then you always bump up against the notion of altered states of consciousness, that the ability to alter your state of consciousness that some people have demonstrably achieved by breathing techniques, obviously by drugs, ayahuasca and the rest of the hallucinogens, psychoactive substances. Also, sexual practices of certain sorts are said to bring about an altered state of consciousness, which is regarded as advantageous if you want to see beyond the confines of everyday reality. And, so in the case of the two sights, of the second sight, we be talking there about individuals who are able, by whatever means, to induce in themselves an altered state of consciousness that raises or opens up their powers of perception and intuition. Are we dealing with any of that in relation to the witness testimony of those 11 folk in Aberdeen in 1748? Where they had they by some means altered their consciousness and thereby made themselves able to perceive something else. And it goes without saying, as I've already said, that today we're generally discouraged from such talk. It's dismissed as fanciful. It's right in there, and it's right folded in with conspiracy theory. If you associate yourself with either, you're putting yourself at risk of social exclusion. When it comes to those who are most conspicuously gifted with the two sides, the name applied to them in the Highlands, certainly, it was seers, those who could see. And the most famous of all the seers, without a doubt, was a man whose birth name was Kenneth Mackenzie, but he was known as Dark Kenneth. Most accounts would say that he was known as Dark Kenneth because he was a dark-skinned, a sallow complexion. But someone that has visions, and not happy visions, portents of doom, might be regarded as having a dark persona. So Kenneth Mackenzie, Dark Kenneth, was supposedly born in the early in the 1600s at Uig, which is a place, a little hamlet on the Isle of Lewis in the Western Isles, and he was mostly connected. The stories about him connect him to the Brahan estate, which was the family seat of the Earls of Seaforth, and he worked there as a labourer. He was the poorest of the poor, regardless of any psychic ability that he may or may not have had. According to the legend, and to be honest, there are those who say that Kenneth Mackenzie, the Brahan Seer, didn't even exist, that he's been sort of reverse engineered into the past. However, if you open up to the story, you're told that his mother, while she was carrying him, pregnant with him, she took a shortcut through a graveyard on a moonless night, and she encountered a ghost. She had a haunting of her very own, in the form of a princess of the Danish royal house. So they come face to face, the mother and the ghostly princess, and the mother has the presence of mind to ask for a wish, which is something that you can apparently request from the shades. And specifically, she asked that her son be granted the sights, the second sight, the two sights. And as far as it goes, the ghost said, "Okay, consider it done, dear." And so then comes Kenneth, and as a child, he comes across a stone, a strange stone called an adder stone, spelt the same way as the poisonous snake. It was blue and black in colour, veins of colour, and it had a naturally formed hole through the middle of it. And when Kenneth looked through it, as a tiny child, he could sometimes see the future. That's the story. And so they call him the Brahan Seer, because of his connection to the Brahan estate. And for all of his life, from childhood onwards, he had all manner of predictions. He had all manner of visions of the future, many of which came true. And as I say, there are those that would tell you that there was no such person, that it's all just a fairy tale. But if you think about it, in the Outer Hebrides of Scotland, in the 1600s, the fact that there's no paperwork, official paperwork, with the registrar, detailing another, person born into obscure poverty, that might not be surprising. That he wasn't, detailed and documented, is not that surprising. And so he becomes part of the oral tradition, along with so much of the rest of the past and the history and the culture of the Highlands. It was committed not to the page, but to memory. And if it was written down at all, it was written down long after the events. So there's all sorts of things that the Brahan Seer saw. The Great Glen is the slash of water that runs diagonally across. It separates the northern third of Scotland from the southern 2/3. It's been called like a sword wound across the body of Scotland. And the Brahan Seer predicted that the four lochs, as they once were, Loch Linnhe, Loch Lochy, Loch Oich and Loch Ness, would eventually be one. And that was fulfilled in the 19th century when the Caledonian Canal was linked them all, so that there was now passage across through Scotland from one sea to the other, without having to go round the body of the land. 2 centuries, fully 2 centuries before the advent of the railways, he had a vision of what he described as black iron horses, breathing smoke and fire and galloping through the glens. He had a prediction about black rain that would come to Aberdeen and make the city rich, 3 centuries before the discovery of North Sea oil. And he said that Scotland would regain a parliament of her own once men could walk dry-shod from England to France. And of course that was made real with the opening of the Channel Tunnel. But years before the Battle of Culloden, you were wondering where I was going with all of this. Years before the Battle of Culloden, which that horror show was on the 16th of April 1746, the Brahan Seer was on Drumossie Moor. Now, everyone knows it as Culloden Moor. Everyone knows it as the Battle of Culloden. But at the time, the terrain over which the fighting occurred was known to one and all as Drumossie Moor. And he was there, he was on Drumossie Moor long before the battle. And for whatever reason, he said, out of nowhere, "O Drumossie, thy bleak moor shall, ere many generations have passed away, be stained with the best blood of the Highlands. Glad I am that I will not see the day, for it will be a fearful period. Heads will be lopped off by the score, and no mercy shall be shown or given on either side." Now, if you know anything about the Battle of Culloden and its aftermath, that's a pretty neat summation of events to make in advance. So, if a country can be haunted by battle, then Scotland is haunted by Culloden. As I am, I freely admit that I think about Culloden, or other things in the day-to-day will remind me of Culloden more than they should. It's there. It haunts me. And, history's a mess, to be honest. As the years go by, I realise that the official line on history is, well, it's the official line. Take from that what you will. And relatively few people read history, really dig into it. And even those that are interested, many of them satisfy themselves with just the official version of events, which in many instances is nothing more than recycled propaganda that suits the party in the position to write the history. So, most people around up and down Britain, I would have thought, if you stopped them in the street and asked them if they know anything at all about Culloden, they would have been affected by the way for the longest time it was caricatured as a fight between Scots and English. Like it was some kind of, bloody football match on a grand scale. You get in people, movies, David Niven's effort and the rest of it, portray, romantic Highlanders, only good, only honourable and brave, in their plaids and so on, up against the sort of myrmidons of the House of Hanover in scarlet tunics. And of course, as is always the case, the truth is more complex and different. More recent generations have been doing a good job of trying to properly to remember Culloden for what it actually was. Myself and Paul, who's the producer of this podcast series, we excavated together for television on Culloden Moor, Drumossie Moor. That was our bit. We were making a little bit of a contribution to trying properly to remember what had actually happened there, rather than what most people think happened there. And if you do spend any time at all digging into the truth of it, literally or metaphorically digging, you come upon the realisation, comfortable or not, that it was just a brutal sideshow that can only be understood in the context of a pan-European war. It was ever thus. Scotland, Britain, so often get sucked into things that are much bigger. What really happened on Culloden Moor, a miserable swatch of moorland. It's not the most attractive place, really. As a visitor destination, it's loaded with history and significance, but it's not very picturesque. It's close by Inverness, the city of Inverness. But what happened there on the 16th of April 1746 was just squalid butchery by a contingent of the British Army, who were really more preoccupied, as well they might be at the time, by a pan-European conflict, remembered as the War of the Austrian Succession. The Habsburg family, the Austrian Habsburgs, they were inbred, not to put too fine a point on it. The Habsburg jaw, which is a sort of vague way of referring to their very distinctive profile of a jutting jaw and a bulbous bottom lip and big noses and all of the rest of it. They were nae aisle painting, as we say in Burns country. So they always had problems producing healthy people because they were forever marrying themselves. They were marrying cousins and all the rest of it. But the War of the Austrian Succession was the fact that the heiress to the house, to the throne, was a woman, Maria Theresa, and she wanted to, or she was being manoeuvred to succeed her father, who was Emperor Charles VI. But of course, her being a woman, that was offending people, and because tradition would have had it that only a man could inherit in that way. And lots of powerful groups took it as an opportunity to force the point. The sides that were minded that way were France, Prussia and Bavaria. But Maria Theresa herself got the backing of Britain, the Dutch Republic, and Hanover, the House of Hanover. So all the great powers of Europe find themselves willingly or unwillingly sucked into another vortex of fighting as powerful people sacrifice their populations in pursuit of power. So Culloden was not a match, between England and Scotland, and neither was it about Catholics fighting Protestants, as it's sometimes portrayed. In fact, the British Army's most committed ally or Britain's most committed ally in the War of the Austrian Succession was Catholic Austria. So what happened essentially was with a view to stirring domestic trouble for the British government and distracting as much as possible of the British Army from business abroad to matters domestic, France, in Machiavellian form, took the opportunity to blow some oxygen over old, angry embers. It was cynical, it was political, and it doomed thousands of people to their deaths. The embers in question were the Jacobite movement, which was this, by that time, long-held determination to put the House of Stuart back on the British throne, which it had vacated. In the context of Culloden this particular, the last Jacobite rebellion, it was Charles Edward Stuart, Bonnie Prince Charlie, that I've already mentioned. For his pains, he was Catholic, and he was sent north. He was dispatched by the French King, Louis XV. Go up and make trouble there, in the hope that the British would have to pull troops back out of Europe, but away from the War of the Austrian Succession to deal with trouble, back at home. Charles Edward Stuart's grandfather had been James II and Seventh. That's this King James VII of Scotland, but he was simultaneously the second King James of Great Britain. James was Catholic and he was a Stuart, and he'd been dethroned by his own son-in-law and nephew, the Protestant William of Orange. That was the event in 1688, remembered as the Glorious Revolution or the Bloodless Revolution. I mean, in reality, it was much less that's the way it's been painted by those that gained from it. But I mean, it was much less a glorious revolution and more of a Dutch invasion of Britain. That's effectively what it was. The Dutch invaded Britain in 1688 and took the throne. With the determined support in Britain of those who were determined to boost the power of Parliament in relation to the monarch. there were factions within the British Parliament who wanted to, make Parliament sovereign, take more power into Parliament rather than the monarch, far less the people. James the Second and Seventh's daughters by his first marriage were Mary and Anne, and Mary and Anne reigned after him. And it was when Anne, the younger of them, died without an heir in 1714, the Stuart dynasty was set aside by Parliament to make way for the House of Hanover. Now, James the Elder, James the Seventh and Second, had died in 1701, and that made his son, the would-be James the Third and Eighth. He's remembered by fanciful traditional history as the old pretender to the British throne. And so it was in his name, it was in the name of James the Third and Eighth, the would-be Stuart monarch, to put the Stuarts back on the British throne. It was in his name that Bonnie Prince Charlie, the young pretender, assumed leadership of the rebellion they called the 45, because it kicked off in 1745, and he sailed from France to the little Hebridean island of Eriskay off the west coast of Scotland, and he was accompanied by 7 followers, remembered as the 7 men of Neudart. And for those interested in such things, esoterica and the like, 7 is a recurrent number at moments of significance. You'd be surprised how often the number 7 is either there or somehow gets embroidered onto a story that's supposed to have or does have some kind of celestial or cosmic significance. That thing, Charlie, Bonnie Prince Charlie, nobody called him Charlie. He was royalty. He was Charles. Apparently, what happened there was when he arrived amongst the Gaelic-speaking Highlanders, they didn't really have Charles as a name. It was unfamiliar to them. And so they kind of Gallicised it into Terlach. So they were shouting Terlach. And when English speakers heard Terlach, they thought that the Highlanders were calling him Charlie. So it was effectively a misunderstanding that's come to be fossilised in the legend of the Battle of Culloden and the 1745 rebellion. Supporters of James, King James, there would be James the Third and Eighth, they called themselves Jacobites from Jacobus, which is the Latin form of James. Don't ask me why they took the Latin form of the name, but Jacobus, hence Jacobites. They want the return of the Stuarts, and they went to war multiple times, 4 times in fact, from the 1600s through the 1700s. So by the time we get to 1745, the War of Austrian Succession is in full flood. France goes for a final roll of the dice, a final use to be made of Jacobitism. By then, by 1745, the War of Austrian Succession had metastasised. It had gone all over. There were bits of it being fought in North America. There were bits of it being fought in the Caribbean. So when Charles Edward Stuart arrives, there's support in theory amongst the clans, both Catholic and Protestant, for various reasons, political. But his arrival, when he actually turned up on Eriskay and then made his way onto mainland Scotland, as I say, he was accompanied by the 7 men of Neudart, but precious little else. There had been an expectation that he would come with a French army and French weapons, and French ships. And so when he turned up, really just me, myself and I, the reception for him was kind of cool, because people could see the writing on the wall. We don't have the domestic clout to do this. And right away, people were telling him just to go home. Leave. You're going to get us killed. Please go. But famously, whether he said it or not, it said that he said, "How can I go home when I am come home? Scotland is my home." And then he seemingly was a charismatic figure. He was a bonny lad, and he was a good talker, and he managed to kick up some momentum. As I already mentioned in my own personal context, he got support from Donald Cameron of Lochiel, the gentle Lochiel. Gentle as in he was a gentleman. He was a dignified and aristocratic character known as Gentle Lochiel. And he stepped up with his several hundred men and said, we'll back him. And that was the first, that was the spark, that could be kindled into the Jacobite rebellion of 1745. The hundreds and then the thousands do come in. The Highland clans come in around them, and they head south. They win a battle at Preston Pans, which is East Lothian, in the vicinity of Edinburgh, but not Edinburgh. Then they move on from the victory at the Battle of Preston Pans to occupy Edinburgh. Right? They move in grand style. Bonnie Prince Charlie moves into the palace of Holyrood House. Then they invade England, and they get as far as Derby, just 120 odd miles from London. And at that point, the juggernaut starts to run out of steam. All the hubris, all the optimism, all the confidence starts to. One thing leads to another. Most significantly of all, Charles has been saying all the time that English Jacobites, English supporters of the cause of replacing the House of Hanover with the House of Stuart, will rise, and they'll join them. So now it'll become a combined English and Scottish Jacobite force. But it never materialises. There's no appetite for it. People aren't, the English Jacobites keep their heads down. They're not prepared to roll the dice. One thing leads to another, and eventually, although Charles wants to push on, he says if we just turn up in London, the garrisons will melt away in front of us, and we'll have the city, and we'll take Parliament, and so on, and I'll be back. But he loses out. He doesn't carry that, and so the whole charabanc turns around and heads back north on the retreat. And at this point, it's the beginning of the end. En route, they try and take Stirling Castle, which is just up there. But the garrison, the British Army garrison within the walls, is too strong. Their guns are too much, so they move on. There's a final clash, the final battle. Well, the penultimate battle of the 1745 Jacobite rebellion is at Falkirk. It's a bloody encounter. It's really a bit inconclusive, but it's often counted as a Jacobite win. But they're badly mauled as well, and they're still retreating anyway. And they keep moving north, all the way to Inverness. On the 15th of April, there's an attempt at a night march, which Paul and I, the team, we dutifully tried to recreate as part of making the television documentary. The Jacobites, the Highlanders, the Bonnie Prince Charlie and his advisors, they knew that it was the birthday of William Augustus, Duke of Cumberland. He was the leader of the British Army force that had come north to tackle them. He was the third and youngest son of King George II of the House of Hanover. He was also the Captain General of the British Army. He was in charge. He was in charge. And it was his birthday. It had been his birthday on the 15th of April. And there was the thinking was that all the soldiers would be drunk. They'd be full of army rations of rum and all of the rest of it. And that if they attacked them at night, they might be able to get the better of them rather than wait for daylight and all of that implied. But it was bungled. They didn't make it as far. They didn't ever clash with the British Army at Nairn. And so at some god-awful point in the middle of the night, exhausted and bedraggled, they turn around and pull back towards Drumossie Moor. And by this time, the British Army redcoats are aware of them, and they're following them. So by the time dawn breaks on the 16th of April, 1746, on Drumossie Moor, those Jacobites that are still there, and remember, during the night and the rest of it, there's been desertions. People have started drifting away because they can predict what's coming. Whether or not they've got the gift of second sight, they can see the writing on the wall. And so it's a pretty sorry, hungry, exhausted bunch of Highlander Jacobites that line up on Drumossie Moor to face the inevitable. And what happens next is the stuff of legend. The two forces, the Jacobites are kind of they've pulled themselves into whatever order they can, and they have to stand and watch as the British Army the machinery of it starts forming up in front of them, separated by a few hundred metres. They can see the heavy guns getting put into position. They can see all the men in serried ranks, all the muskets, all the bayonets, all of the rest of it. And so, the Jacobites just stand and watch it. They're outnumbered, outgunned. The heavy guns, the British guns, fire towards the Jacobites. causing, carnage. Heavy shot being fired into the Jacobite ranks. They stand and take it for a brief period, a few minutes, and then either given an order or because they've been sort of harried beyond endurance, the Jacobites launch an attack, and they come charging across level ground, hopeless, boggy ground. They're easy targets for the British guns. They switch from round shot to grape shot, which basically turns the cannons into gigantic shotguns. Those Jacobites that run onto it are turned into pink mist by the hundreds. There's a part of the Jacobite line that makes it as far as the soldiers. They engage them with their swords and with their shields and so on, but they're dealt with. The British Army is more disciplined, it's more organised. There's a musket drill, then there's a bayonet drill, and pretty soon, within goodness knows, it's probably just minutes really, half an hour, there's a bloody rout begins as those that still can turn and run, trying to get off the field, and they're pursued by mounted dragoons. So there's British cavalry on horseback running them down as they try and leave the field. They try and regroup. There's some talk of those that can, coming together in a group and preparing to fight again, but no, it's done. The 45 rebellion is over. Bonnie Prince Charlie has already been whipped off the field. He was never in the thick of the fighting, and he's spirited away, first of all into the Highlands, then into the islands of the west, over the sea to Skye and so on. He lives as a fugitive for 4 or 5 months. Then he's brought back to the mainland. Then he's put on a ship bound for France and into a lifetime of exile. He lives and then dies in Italy as a bloated and dissolute yesterday's man. And those he left behind on the field at Drumossie Moor were far less fortunate. There might have been 5,000 who stood to before the fighting started. Of them, 1,500, there or thereabouts, were killed, either during the fighting or in the aftermath. The Duke of Cumberland, so the British commander, had apparently claimed afterwards that he'd come upon Jacobite orders recovered on the field of battle that said that had been orders given to the Jacobites that they would give no quarter, which is to say they wouldn't spare any British lives. They would kill indiscriminately anyone that they encountered. And whether or not this was true or just a fabrication, it became the justification for wholesale slaughter of the Jacobite wounded. So they went about the battlefield, and rather than tending to the Jacobite wounded, they just either shot them or bayoneted them to death. And the same thing happened to prisoners that had been taken. They were just dispatched by musket and bayonet. It was an atrocity. There's no getting away from it. That was just on the battlefield in the immediate aftermath of the fighting, but there was then a determined attempt by Cumberland and the British Army to slight the Highlands, which is to say to break them, really, to break the culture, to break the people, to decimate, to destroy the culture, to break the spirit of the Highlands. And it was pretty effectively achieved. The wearing of plaid was outlawed in the aftermath. The bagpipes were outlawed. The Gaelic language was outlawed. The whole way of life was outlawed, and the ancient clan system that had held communities together was torn asunder. When news reached London of the victory, Cumberland was initially celebrated, and he was named as Sweet William after a fragrant flower that grows on Drumossie Moor and elsewhere. But then more information began to circulate about the fact that it had actually been an atrocity, that it was a war crime, and his nicknames changed to Butcher Cumberland and also Stinking Billy. So rather than being named after something fragrant, he was given another nickname for another less fragrant flower. He had been tipped for greatness, the Duke of Cumberland. He was a very able soldier, he was tactically very able, but he never recovered from what he did at Culloden. Whether he was told to do it or whether he just did it himself, whether the brutality was his own idea, it ruined him. And he subsequently quietly resigned his command and was never a soldier again. So, as the Brahan Seer had said it would be, so it came to pass, a bleak moor stained with the best blood of the Highlands. And, you know, if you go to Culloden, it's an amazing place. And the place is haunted. Culloden Moor is spectacularly haunted if you are open-minded to the reports that have come in down through the decades and centuries since 1746. There are recurrent themes. A lot of people have reported an encounter with a tall man, a Jacobite, wearing the plaid, wearing the woolen clothes of the Highlander. Usually people say that he's muttering to himself, that he seems distressed and distracted, and if you hear him, he's talking about defeat and all the rest of it. There's another famous story, has a woman, a tourist, finding a sheet of plaid laid across one of the supposed mass graves, and as the story goes, when she lifts it, there's a dead Highlander beneath it, who just, in the vision, you know, it disappears, dissolves into thin air. People, if they're there by luck or good judgment on the 16th of April, on the anniversary, often there are talks of people say they can hear it. They can hear steel on steel. They can hear distant gunfire. They can hear the cries of suffering men. Some people even claim that they've seen, you know, the movement of soldiers charging, soldiers fighting. There have been 3 different visitor centres on Culloden battlefield. The one that's there now was built around, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago, and it's got you know, holographic reenactments of the battle and all sorts of things going on inside it. But an earlier iteration of the visitor centre, there was a visit by 2 ladies of an age, you know, mature ladies, one of whom lived nearby, and they got a hold of a member of staff, and they made it plain that they knew all about that ill-fated night march to Nairn that I told you about by the Jacobites, and they knew in detail that actually the force had split in the early hours, and that one of the commanders had decided to go further towards Nairn, and the other had about turned and taken his men back to Drumossie. They knew all the details of this, but what they specifically wanted was to see a map, a contemporary map of the disposition of the soldiers and the layout of the events that had unfolded, and a map was duly produced. And when the night march was laid out on it, because the guy in the visitor centre was a guide, he knew what he was talking about. And when he showed the line that the night march had taken, the woman who lived nearby, the one of the 2 women who lived nearby, pointed at a house that was detailed on the map and said, "That's my house." And the whole point of her visit was that down through the years living in that house, she had often been disturbed during the night by the sound of people moving by. She could hear the clank of horse furniture, and she could hear, you know, voices, and she could hear the sound of many men moving. And she would look out her window, or she would go out into the darkness, and there'd be nothing there. But having been shown the route of the night march, she satisfied herself that, you know, these disturbances, these nocturnal disturbances that she'd had down through the years, were the echoes across time of the sound of those Jacobites making their weary way back to the moor and destruction at the Battle of Culloden. And I've already sort of detailed the way in which the Brahan Seer saw it coming, but there were more than he that had premonitions. Namely, the Lord Advocate and Lord President of the Court of Session at the time was a man called Duncan Forbes, and he had his ancestral pile at Culloden House, overlooking Drumossie Moor. It was the cartographers in the British Army named Culloden because they took it from the local landmark, which was Culloden House, that they were able to identify. They didn't know anything about Drumossie Moor, they called it Culloden. So that was and had been, before and after the battle, the home of Duncan Forbes. Now, Forbes, for his own part, had done everything he could to prevent the clans from rising. He was a supporter of the British government, he was a supporter of the House of Hanover, and he'd actually spent his own money. He'd spent a small fortune. In fact, he'd ruined himself trying to buy off the clans, giving them money on the promise that they wouldn't rise in support of the Jacobite rebellion. Of course, he wasn't able to do enough, but he was ruined financially, if not spiritually, because he was never reimbursed. In the aftermath of what happened, he wasn't given a penny by the British government, so he'd spent all that money in vain. But weeks before the battle, he was in his house. He was in Culloden House, and he was looking out of a window over Drumossie Moor when he was heard to say, "All these things may fall out, but depend on it, all these disturbances will end on this spot." So, weeks before the fighting, weeks before events dictated that Bonnie Prince Charlie and his rag-bag bunch of Jacobites would end up turning for a last stand on Drumossie Moor, Duncan Forbes, one way or another, saw it coming. He had his own premonition. Gaelic folklore, of which there is much, has a figure called the Ben Naya, which is to say the washerwoman. And a sight of the washerwoman, the Ben Naya, is always bad news. The Highlands are full of augurs of bad luck. If they see deer, if deer come down off the hills and into the village, if you go out into your village, traditionally down in the low ground, and there's deer have found their way onto the roads, that is always a forewarning of death to come. Many instances of it. The Isle disaster, the loss of the ship that was carrying Highland soldiers back after the First World War, that sank with the loss of hundreds of lives. The villages to which the men ought to have returned in the aftermath, they reported that they had seen deer walking kind of wide-eyed and lost through the streets of the villages, and the villagers had known there was a disaster coming. But so there are many ways in which the Highland folklore is able to predict disaster, but significant among them is Ben Naya, the washerwoman. And Ben Naya, the washerwoman, is a woman who died in childbirth, and it's her fate to appear to people as a warning. And sometime before the Battle of Culloden, Donald Cameron, the gentle Lochiel, supposedly my ancestor, he saw the Ben Naya washing blood-soaked burial shrouds in a stream. She's always washing. She's the washerwoman. And he interpreted what he was seeing as a warning that once again the washerwoman was preparing the funeral shrouds of the dead to come. And so it came to pass. Gentle Lochiel was on the field at Culloden, and he watched scores of Camerons, maybe my ancestors among them, dropping on the field. So his premonition came true as well. But unique to Culloden, I mean, we've contemplated the battlefield at Aughrim in Ireland and so on, but unique to Culloden is an apparition called the Skree, Skree. Now, of all the soldiers who supported and advised Charles Edward Stuart, nobody was more sober and serious and able than Lieutenant General Lord George Murray. He was Charles's significant advisor throughout, for the duration, heading south and heading back north, and he was there at Culloden. They fell out. The two men fell out before Culloden because he lost his temper with Charles eventually, because he was so certain that to stand on the field at Culloden was just a disaster. He could foretell what would happen if that battle was allowed to unfold in the way that it would have to, and so he lost it. He lost it with the prince. But nonetheless, he was there. He was there throughout. He stood his ground. He had been the mastermind at Prestonpans, which was that early victory that they had, and he also masterminded the retreat from Derby, which was skillful enough. He got all those men all that way home through hostile territory. But on the evening, back to the Skree, on the evening before the battle, so on the evening of the 15th of April, he was amongst several people who saw in the sky above the battlefield to come a winged horror, some sort of hideous creature. It was shrieking, it was filling the air with a terrible hair-raising noise, it looked apparently like a kind of a harpy. You know those winged demons in Greek mythology? Well, it was called the Scree by those that saw it, and it appeared in the air above Drumossie Moor. And Lieutenant General Lord George Murray was amongst those that testified to seeing it. And he was not the kind of guy that would be likely to make something like that up or to be swept along by something that didn't happen. So you have to wonder, apparently it had a human head and its eyes blazed red. And Lord George Murray said he saw it. Now, it appeared there on the night before the battle, but in the modern era, in a book called Culloden Tales by a writer called Hugh Allison, he recounts an experience had by a battlefield tour guide. If you go to Culloden now, there's people there, men and women, who will walk you around the battlefield and they'll explain the way that the battle unfolded. So one of these, who's identified in the book, the Culloden Tales, only as Mike, there's no surname given, but he's with a party of tourists. He had taken them out at night under a full moon, okay, which is, you know, an experience that you can have on the Culloden battlefield. And as it was a beautiful night. You know, it was moonlit. It was clear. There was a cold edge to it. You know, it was winter time, and they were in the position that is kind of memorialised as having been where the British Army front line was. It's marked with flags, but you can identify the stretch where the British front line stood before the battle. And he and the tourists that he was with were confronted on the path that they were walking along, a sort of gravel path, by this, what they thought at first was a gigantic broken umbrella on the ground, covering the path from one side to the other. And as they got close to it, it spread its wings and took to the air. And he described it as a giant black bat. They could hear its wings creaking, you know, as it took to the sky. And it stayed around them for a few seconds and then disappeared. Just like he said, it didn't fade. It disappeared like someone turning off a television set. You know, it was visible and then it was gone. And they ran about. They ran about in the dark looking for any sign of the thing, but they saw nothing. Back to the Brahan Seer. His gift was his undoing in the end. He was summoned before Isabella, who was the wife of the Earl of Seaforth, whose seat Bran was, the Brahan estate. And she demanded, her husband was away in Paris, which is a long way from the Outer Hebrides at that time. And she demanded to hear from the Brahan Seer, from Dark Kenneth, what he could tell her of what was happening to her husband. She wanted news. And at first he was a bit evasive and would say only that as far as he could see, the Earl of Seaforth was fine. He was healthy and well. But Isabella suspected that he was withholding from her something that he had seen but wouldn't say. So she threatened to have him killed if he didn't tell all. And so, under pain of death, he said, "Okay, well, your husband is with another woman and she's much prettier than you." And, well, Isabella lost it and condemned the Brahan Seer to a terrible death, which is to say, she told her people to prepare a barrel of boiling pitch, tar, and that he was to be thrown headfirst into it, which indeed is what apparently happened to the Brahan Seer under the orders of Isabella of the House of Seaforth. But before he died, before he was thrown into the barrel, he said that the Seaforth line would end with an heir who was deaf and mute. He foretold it. And in due course, in the years to come, the Earl of Seaforth was one Francis Humbertson Mackenzie, who, right enough, had been rendered both deaf and mute by scarlet fever in his childhood, but he nonetheless inherited the earldom. He married Mary Proby in 1782, and together the couple had 9 children, 4 boys and 5 girls. All 4 boys died in childhood, 3 of the 5 girls died in childhood. And so, as the Brahan Seer had predicted, the line ended with Francis Humbertson Mackenzie, who was deaf and mute, and he was the last of his line. Given that he only had surviving daughters, they married and the name fell away. And for the last few years of his life, although he did learn to speak again, although he regained the ability to speak, for the last few years of his life, he was rendered mute again, apparently by his grief. So it's all, as it so often is, it's terrible sadness, terrible cruelty, terrible bloodshed, and it leaves something behind. And then just to come back to that 1748 testimony by the 11 men and women who tell the council in Aberdeen about seeing these three bright lights in the sky, and then 12 tall men in distinctive outfits. And then they see what they interpret as the Battle of Culloden being fought again, but events unfolding the way they might have wanted them to, which is to say, with the routing of a red force by the Jacobites in blue. Distance from the events invites us to be sceptical. You hear testimony like that and think, it's just make-believe. It's just make-believe. I would say there's much more there than meets the eye.